Summer 1945. Inside a POW camp in the American Midwest, rows of barracks stood under a bright sky. Japanese prisoners had grown used to the daily rhythm: roll call, work details, meals, lights out. But one June morning, rumors began to ripple across the yard. A group of prisoners had been chosen for something unusual: a trip outside the wire. No one believed it at first. They assumed it was a transfer, maybe to another camp or a work site. Going outside the barbed wire was unheard of, except for farm details. Yet the guards confirmed it. A bus would come tomorrow. Prisoners would be allowed to change into clean clothes. They would be given identification cards. Even stranger, the guards warned there would be crowds. Crowds. Prisoners exchanged puzzled glances. Where could they be going? Some whispered about forced labor or propaganda parades. Others thought it might be an interrogation tactic. The idea of being taken anywhere willingly seemed absurd. That night, the barracks buzzed with speculation. Some prisoners secretly hoped for a glimpse of real America: towns, houses, civilians, things they had only seen from train windows on the way to camp. They remembered the warnings their officers had drilled into them before capture. Americans were ruthless, humiliation inevitable. Yet every new experience in the camp had undermined those ideas. Still, the notion of being taken off camp property to mingle with civilians felt like a step too far, like a trap. As the sun set, the chosen group sat on their bunks, polishing their boots and folding their clothes as if preparing for an inspection. Some wrote quick letters, hoping they'd be allowed to mail them later. Others simply stared at the ceiling, wondering what awaited them beyond the wire. Outside, the American guards moved quietly, loading papers and clipboards into jeeps. It wasn't a trick. It was a plan. The bus was already waiting at the county fairgrounds 20 miles away, and the stage was set for an encounter that would shatter the prisoners' expectations. By morning, they would step not into a courtroom or labor site, but into the chaos and color of an American county fair. The next morning dawned clear and hot. A khaki-colored bus rolled up to the camp gate, its engine rumbling as guards formed the prisoners into a line. Each man carried an ID tag on a string around his neck, a small paper pass stamped with the camp number. Their clothes were clean but still marked PW in large letters. They climbed aboard quietly, taking seats along the windows. 2 American guards followed, rifles slung but not raised, their faces unreadable behind sunglasses. As the bus pulled out, the prisoners craned their necks for a glimpse of the world beyond the wire. For the first time in months, no fences, no towers, only open road. The Midwest rolled past in a blur of green fields and white farmhouses. Some prisoners pressed their palms to the glass, staring at tractors, barns, and children playing near porches. A few dared to whisper to each other in Japanese. "This is America? It's so quiet." Another said, "Where are they taking us?" The guards remained calm, checking papers occasionally, pointing out landmarks. One guard even offered a piece of chewing gum to a prisoner, who took it with hesitation. As the bus crested a hill, a colorful scene unfolded in the distance: flags, tents, Ferris wheels, and rows of parked cars. The prisoners blinked, thinking it must be a military camp. Then they saw signs in English: "County Fair, welcome all." The reality sank in. They were being taken to a public festival. Shock rippled through the bus. These men had been told Americans hated them, that they would be jeered or worse. Instead, they were heading to a place of music, food, and crowds. A corporal sitting near the window whispered, "Will they chain us there?" Another muttered, "It's a test." But as the bus slowed near the fairgrounds, no chains appeared, no blindfolds. only a line of local deputies and MPS waiting to escort them politely into the gates. Beyond, the air shimmered with the smell of fried food, livestock pens, and popcorn. A world utterly alien to men who had crossed the Pacific as soldiers. For the first time, the POWs realized the rumors were true. They were about to walk among civilians at an American county fair. The bus hissed to a stop at the edge of the fairgrounds. Dust swirled around the wheels as county deputies and military police formed a loose corridor. One by one, the Japanese POWs stepped down, blinking against the bright sun, their boots crunching on gravel. The smell of popcorn and grilled meat hit them immediately. They expected shouting or spitting. Instead, they heard the squeal of children on rides and the bark of vendors selling lemonade. A Ferris wheel spun lazily in the distance, its metal arms glinting. Banners flapped above stalls selling pies, jams, and livestock feed. It was a portrait of rural America they had only seen in pamphlets. Local civilians stared, curious but not hostile. Some pointed at the PW stencils on the prisoners' shirts. Others whispered. But no one threw anything. The guards arranged the POWs in two lines, explaining through an interpreter that they could walk the grounds under escort. No running, no entering restricted areas, but otherwise free to look. Shock deepened as they realized the Americans weren't hiding them. They were in full view of families, teenagers, and farmers. Children gawked, holding cotton candy. One prisoner muttered, "They're not afraid of us?" Another stared at the Ferris wheel as though it were a machine from another planet. The group began moving slowly down the main lane of the fair. Livestock pens lined one side, carnival games the other. The smells of hay and frying dough mingled in the warm air. A farmer's wife waved timidly at the group. A boy holding a balloon stared up at a prisoner barely older than himself. The scene felt surreal, almost theatrical. A POW who had fought on Guadalcanal whispered that in Japan, captured enemies would never be paraded before civilians, let alone allowed to mingle with them. The guards kept a respectful distance, hands near their holsters, but no rifles raised. It felt more like a school field trip than a prisoner movement. By the time the group reached the first exhibition hall, the POWs were no longer sure if they were captives or guests. And deep down, a strange mix of embarrassment, awe, and curiosity began to replace their fear. The fairground lane opened into a long stretch of food stalls. The POWs could smell roasting corn, frying dough, and sweet cider drifting through the air. For men who had survived on army rations and camp meals, the smells were almost dizzying. Some slowed their steps, inhaling as though trying to memorize the scents. Local townspeople approached in small groups, some with cautious smiles, others with notebooks, curious, not hostile. They asked questions through the interpreter. "Where are you from? How long have you been here?" At first, the POWs answered stiffly, their eyes down. Years of indoctrination told them this was humiliation. Yet the Americans' faces showed no contempt, only fascination. A farmer offered a POW an apple straight from a basket. The prisoner hesitated, glancing at his guard. The guard nodded. Slowly he took it, biting into crisp sweetness he hadn't tasted in years. Nearby, a teenage girl stared at the prisoners' uniforms, then at their faces, as if trying to reconcile the image of an enemy with the young men before her. The POWs noticed children weaving between their legs, pointing at the PW letters but not running away. It was disorienting. No jeers, no stones, only curiosity. One prisoner whispered, "They're not afraid." Another said softly, "They see us as men." The interpreter relayed invitations from some vendors. "They can watch the livestock show. They can stand near the bleachers. The guards agreed, but kept their lines tight. At the livestock pen, a POW reached out to touch the flank of a prize hog, laughing at its size. Others marveled at dairy cows bigger than anything they'd seen in Japan. Civilians began to speak more freely, asking about Japan, about the war, about family. The POWs responded haltingly, discovering they still remembered English phrases learned long ago. A woman pressed a small paper cup of lemonade into one man's hand. He bowed instinctively. She laughed softly as if surprised by the gesture. By now, the POW's initial stiffness had begun to melt. They were still under guard, but the air of suspicion had thinned. For the first time since boarding the bus, some began to smile, unsure whether it was allowed, but unable to stop themselves. By midday, the sun beat down on the fairgrounds. The POWs had walked nearly the entire main lane, their eyes darting from livestock pens to bright-colored booths. The guards led them toward the heart of the fair, a place of games, contests, and rides. The Ferris wheel loomed overhead, its cars creaking slowly as children waved from above. Some prisoners tilted their heads back, stunned. Rides like these existed in Tokyo, but to see one in a small American town felt like entering a movie. A guard pointed out the grandstand where a pie-eating contest was underway. The POWs chuckled softly at the sight of farmers diving face first into whipped cream, their pride swallowed in laughter. Nearby, a band played country tunes from a wooden stage. Fiddles and banjos rang out over the crowd. The prisoners listened in silence, trying to match the rhythms to anything they knew back home. The smell of grilled meat wafted over them again. Vendors turned steaks on iron griddles, flames licking the edges. It was a sensory overload, sound, smell, and color unlike anything inside camp. A boy offered a POW a balloon on a string. The man smiled awkwardly and accepted, bowing slightly. The guards glanced at each other but did not intervene. Women in summer dresses walked past, glancing curiously but not cruelly at the prisoners. Some nodded politely, as if acknowledging fellow human beings rather than enemy soldiers. The POWs were ushered toward a small exhibit on local crafts, quilts, carved wood, jars of preserves. They whispered among themselves about the abundance of civilian goods, the softness of the fabrics, the sheer variety of color. One prisoner compared it to the Tokyo exhibitions before the war, but noted how ordinary Americans here could afford things that only officers' families could back home. The interpreter explained that the fair was an annual event, older than the war, a tradition of community. The POWs absorbed this quietly, realizing that life here continued despite global conflict. Guards remained nearby, but their rifles were slung, their posture relaxed. The atmosphere felt almost normal, like tourists visiting a festival. The POWs exchanged glances of disbelief. They had expected humiliation or propaganda. Instead, they were walking through a living postcard of America's small-town heart. And for the first time since capture, some of them felt something dangerously close to wonder. As the afternoon wore on, the POWs began to feel a strange tension inside themselves. Each booth, each smile from a civilian, chipped at the image of America they had been taught to hate. They had been warned for years that Americans were violent, dishonorable, eager to humiliate prisoners. Yet here they stood, unchained, surrounded by rides and music. One POW whispered to another, "If they can do this to us, what do they do for their own people?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. They passed a display of prize-winning hogs. A farmer offered them a taste of sausage on toothpicks. The prisoners hesitated, then accepted. It was salty, rich, and warm. They had been told American food was decadent, but it tasted like something familiar, simple meat, prepared well. A few even muttered it was better than their army rations had ever been. At the edge of the livestock show, a local schoolteacher asked through the interpreter if the POWs wanted to watch the band competition. The guards agreed. They sat on wooden benches as teenagers in crisp uniforms marched past, playing brass horns and drums. The POWs stared, stunned by the discipline of children who looked like cadets. It reminded them of their own youth back home. Parades, school ceremonies, the pageantry of empire. But here it was voluntary, cheerful, framed in bright banners. The contrast gnawed at them. How could a nation at war still have energy for fairs and music? How could soldiers be fed steaks while children played brass horns for strangers? A POW muttered, "Maybe this is why they are winning. Not weapons. This..." Another nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the band. As they sat there, the sound of applause rolled over them. For a moment, they forgot they were prisoners, lost in the spectacle of ordinary life. They were beginning to understand the psychological impact of what they were experiencing. A vision of the enemy's society, not as brutal occupiers, but as people thriving in abundance. In that realization lay the seed of doubt, not about their own courage, but about the truth they had been fed about the outside world. And for the first time, they began to feel that captivity was also an education, one that would follow them long after the fair ended. As the sun dipped lower, the fair took on a softer glow. Lanterns flickered on above the stalls, and the smell of fried dough and sweet cider hung heavier in the warm air. The POWs, still under watch, were led toward a quieter corner of the fairground where tables were set up for crafts and small demonstrations. Here, locals were spinning wool, carving wood, and painting signs. A few curious farmers invited the POWs to stand closer and watch. At first, the men held back, but an American guard gestured for them to go ahead. Hesitantly, they approached the tables, peering at the tools and materials. One man tried on a straw hat as a joke. Another dipped his finger in a tin of blue paint, smiling awkwardly, when the children giggled. For the first time, the POWs felt the boundary between themselves and the civilians thin. They were still enemies, yet they were also participants in a moment of normal life. A local schoolteacher handed a prisoner a carved wooden toy and said something softly. The interpreter translated, "For your child, and when you go home." The man bowed deeply, speechless. Nearby, a group of teenagers showed the POWs how to play a ring toss game. The prisoners, shy at first, tossed rings onto pegs while children clapped and laughed. One guard chuckled, shaking his head at the surreal scene. These were supposed to be hardened soldiers. Now they were awkward guests at a county fair. A few POWs exchanged broken English phrases with the locals. "Thank you." "Very good," Japan pointing to themselves. The civilians answered with nods and smiles. The distance created by war shrank into a small space of shared human behavior. It wasn't peace, but it was something like it. As dust settled, music floated over the fairgrounds. The POWs, their guards, and the townspeople all heard the same notes, their footsteps unconsciously slowing to the rhythm. For a moment, none of them were sure who was prisoner and who was free. There were only people under lantern light, tasting fair food and hearing country music. And in that moment, the POWs felt something they had not expected at all: connection. Night fell slowly over the fairgrounds, but the fair didn't fade. Rows of electric lights blinked on, outlining the rides, booths, and pathways in soft yellow and white. For the Japanese POWs who had grown up under wartime blackouts, the glow felt almost supernatural. Electricity poured everywhere, without rationing, without fear of bombs. The Ferris wheels spun like a glowing halo, and the tents shone like lanterns, One POW whispered, "It's like a festival back home, but brighter." The guards loosened the formation, allowing the prisoners to linger near the edge of the rides. Civilians moved around them easily. No one panicked, no one ran. They saw children running with sparklers, teenagers eating candy apples, women in dresses chatting with soldiers off duty. It was an image of a nation untouched by invasion. The POWs noticed the abundance, not just in lights, but in food. Stalls still selling fresh batches of corn dogs and popcorn even though the crowd was thinning. One man muttered, "In Japan, we ration rice grain by grain. Here they throw food away." The words hung heavy, half awe, half bitterness. At a soda stand, a guard bought root beers for himself and, surprisingly, for two prisoners. They held the cold bottles as if they were fragile treasures, unsure how to drink from them. The interpreter explained how county fairs were financed by ticket sales, community donations, and decades of tradition. This wasn't military propaganda. This was America's normal. The POWs stared at neon signs advertising radio stations, farm equipment, and even new cars. It was a dizzying portrait of civilian power behind the military machine. Several prisoners, trained engineers, and mechanics back in Japan whispered to each other about the machinery running the rides. They tried to calculate how much electricity it took. For them, the fair at night was not just entertainment. It was a lesson in industrial depth, a sign of how much power America could wield quietly. One young POW looked up at the Ferris wheels, spinning lights, and said softly, "This is why we lost." His friend nodded but said nothing. They had come expecting humiliation. Instead, they were staring into a vision of a society so abundant it could offer prisoners a night at the fair. As the fair began to wind down, the guards gathered the POWs near the exit. Lanterns flickered above them, and the music of the last band drifted like a lullaby. The prisoners looked back at the Ferris wheel still glowing in the night. None of them spoke, but their eyes were wide, trying to burn the image into memory. They were led quietly toward the waiting bus. No chains, no shouts, only the crunch of gravel under boots and the smell of fried dough fading behind them. Once seated, they glanced out the windows as the fair receded into the distance, a dream of lights and noise shrinking into darkness. The guards moved down the aisle, counting softly. One soldier collected empty soda bottles. Another handed out paper cups of water for the ride. The bus engine growled and pulled away from the fairgrounds. Inside, the POWs sat in near silence, still tasting sugar on their lips, still smelling smoke from the grills. A few whispered to each other in Japanese, their words low and uncertain. Did we imagine it? No, it was real. Some pressed their foreheads to the windows, watching the fields slide by under moonlight. Farmhouses glowed faintly in the distance, their electric lights steady and unafraid. In the back of the bus, an older prisoner muttered that this trip had shown him more about America than any propaganda leaflet ever could. A guard overheard and smiled faintly, but said nothing. The silence was no longer hostile. It was thoughtful, like the hush after a sermon. The bus rattled over a bridge, and the POWs glimpsed their own reflections in the glass. Tired, curious, changed. As the camp lights appeared on the horizon, the prisoners sat up straighter, bracing for the familiar world of fences and watchtowers. Yet the experience of the fair clung to them like the scent of popcorn on their clothes. It would follow them back behind the wire, and as the bus rolled through the gates, they realized they were bringing back more than souvenirs. They were carrying a story they would never forget. Back inside the camp, the POWs shuffled off the bus, still dazed. The night air was cooler here, and the familiar crunch of gravel under their boots felt almost strange. They expected roll call, inspections, maybe even punishment. Instead, the guards simply logged their return and waved them toward the barracks. Inside, under dim bulbs, the prisoners sat on their bunks, staring at their hands as though holding invisible souvenirs. A few still had the straw hats, paper programs, or tiny carved trinkets they'd been given. They passed them quietly from bunk to bunk, each man touching the objects like relics. In hushed tones, they began describing what they'd seen. The Ferris wheel, the children, the food, the lights. Some spoke of it with wonder, others with a bitterness they couldn't name. The older prisoners said nothing but listened. Even they couldn't deny that the trip had shaken their certainty about America, about the war, about themselves. Letters were written that night. "We saw things we never imagined," one man scribbled. "They took us to a festival. They fed us like guests." In the days that followed, rumors spread through the entire camp. Men who hadn't gone pressed the others for details. The story grew, gaining almost mythical quality. They spoke of electricity without rationing, of smiling civilians, of children unafraid of enemies. It clashed violently with every story they had been told back home. Even the guards noticed a change. The men who had gone to the fair seemed quieter but less tense. Some even began to volunteer for work details, hoping for another glimpse of the outside world. Months later, when repatriation ships finally took them back to Japan, these same men would tell their families about the day they saw a different America. Not the battlefield, but the county fair. Historians would later find their accounts, scattered through diaries and interviews, evidence of how small gestures and ordinary life could break through propaganda. For the POWs, the county fair wasn't just an outing. It was a moment when the war briefly paused, when enemies became human, and when a nation revealed its power not only through weapons, but through normalcy. And long after barbed wire faded from memory, the smell of fried dough, the sight of electric lights, and the sound of country music would remain the day they were taken to a county fair under guard and saw a different world.